and when you stop and look at it again, that's really part of the appeal. So from the frame shape to the lighting setup and the overall stance, this bike has a style that feels very different from a typical e-bike. It's not just built for transportation, it's built to have presence too. Alright, so next up, I'm taking the WALFISK WF750 out for a real riding test. We're going to see how it feels cruising through the city park, how the suspension handles normal urban roads, and how it responds on some rougher and more uneven sections. I'll also be testing the acceleration and seeing what kind of top speed this bike can actually do. For the first part of the ride, I started in pedal assist mode and used PAS5. At this setting, the bike feels more lively right away, and even light pedaling gives you a strong amount of support. So the overall feel here is quick, easy, and very responsive. Then I switched down to PAS1 and kept pedaling, and this immediately makes the ride feel more natural and more relaxed. You still get help from the motor, but it comes in much more gently, so it feels closer to a traditional bike with a little extra boost in the background. For casual park riding like this, it's smooth, easy to control, and very comfortable. After that, I switched over to full electric mode in level 5. And this is definitely the most effortless way to ride the bike. At this point, you can just focus on the road and let the bike do most of the work. The throttle response feels smooth. The power delivery is easy to manage, and for simple cruising like this, it feels relaxed and convenient. Even through the corners, the bike feels surprisingly agile for this type of bike. The compact frame, upright riding position, and wide tires make it feel stable and easy to control in everyday riding. It's not a super aggressive sport machine, but it feels smooth, confident, and easy to handle. For the last section, I changed to PAS2 and went back to pedaling. This feels like a really nice middle ground. Compared with PAS1, you get a bit more assistance, but it still feels natural and controlled. So overall, this setting gives you a good balance between comfort, support, and a more active riding feel. Alright, now let's see how the WALFISK WF750 does in the acceleration test. For this part, I ran multiple 0 to 20 mph pulls to get a better idea of how consistent the bike really is. On the first run, the bike went from 0 to 20 mph in 6 seconds. That's a pretty solid result for this type of bike, and the power comes in smoothly without feeling too abrupt. For the second run, it came in at 7 seconds, so it's just a touch slower here, but still very much in the same overall range. On the third run, it was back to 6 seconds again. That shows the bike is staying fairly consistent from pull to pull. And on the fourth run, the result was 7 seconds. So across all 4 tests, the numbers stayed between 6 and 7 seconds, which is actually pretty consistent. So overall, the WF750 is delivering a 0 to 20 miles per hour time in the 6 to 7 second range. That means the bike feels responsive enough for everyday riding, quick starts, and normal city use, while still keeping the power delivery smooth and easy to control. It's also worth mentioning that these tests were done with the battery already down by 1 bar, so this wasn't a full battery run. And with a full charge, there's a good chance the bike could be just a little bit quicker. So for this level of performance, the acceleration feels pretty respectable. Now let's move on and see how the top speed looks out on the road. Alright, now it's time for the top speed test. For this run, I'm using my phone's GPS to check the real speed, so we can compare that with what the bike's display is showing. As the bike starts building speed, the power comes on smoothly and it keeps pulling in a very steady way. It doesn't feel overly aggressive, but it does feel stable and controlled as the speed climbs. Once it gets closer to the top end, the bike continues to hold speed pretty well. According to the bike's display, the speed here reaches 30 miles per hour. According to the phone GPS, the bike reached 45 kilometers per hour, which is about 28 miles per hour. So overall, the WALFISK WF750 reached a GPS tested top speed of about 28 miles per hour, while the display showed a 30 miles per hour. That's still a solid result for everyday riding, and more importantly, the bike feels smooth and stable while getting there. For this part, I wanted to focus more on how the front suspension actually behaves in everyday road riding. So I rode over both smoother pavement and some rougher sections on purpose, just to see how the fork responds in real conditions. On smoother roads, the front end feels calm and controlled. The fork doesn't feel overly soft or bouncy, and the bike tracks in a pretty stable way. For normal cruising, it gives the front of the bike a solid and planted feel. When riding over smaller imperfections in the road, like surface cracks, rough patches, or light uneven sections, the fork does a good job of taking the edge off those impacts. You can still feel what the road is doing, but the front end doesn't feel harsh or overly busy. Then when I started aiming for some rougher spots and shallow potholes, you can see the fork working more noticeably, and this is where the suspension helps keep the front wheel more settled instead of sending every hit directly back through the bars. So from this angle, it's pretty easy to see the difference between smooth road behavior and rough road behavior. From this wider angle, you get a better look at how the whole bike feels in motion, not just the fork itself. On flat roads, the bike feels smooth, easy, and stable. It's a very relaxed ride, and the front end feels controlled in a way that works well for normal daily use. Once the road gets rougher, that's where the suspension starts to matter more. It helps soften some of the direct shock from bumps and broken pavement, so the ride feels less harsh overall. And when I deliberately ride through rougher sections, and the bike still reacts, but it never feels too unsettled. While the front end stays manageable, and that gives the bike a more confident feel. So for everyday riding, the suspension does a good job balancing comfort and control. For this section, I wanted to push the front suspension a little harder in a more demanding urban environment. So instead of just riding on normal roads, I took the bike through speed bumps, a curb drop of around 20 centimeters, and a much rougher open parking surface. Starting with the loading area speed bumps, you can already see the fork working more actively here. Instead of the front end feeling overly stiff, the suspension helps absorb part of that initial hit and keeps the bike from feeling too harsh at the bars. And then coming down off the curb, the fork has to deal with a much more noticeable impact. And this is where front suspension really starts to matter. You can still feel the drop, of course, but the fork helps soften that landing and keeps the front end from feeling too abrupt. Once the bike gets onto the rough parking surface, the fork is working much more continuously. On this kind of broken and uneven ground, the front suspension helps take some of the sharpness out of repeated impacts. So instead of every bump coming straight back through the bars, the ride feels a little more controlled and easier to manage. So from this close angle, you can really see the difference. On bigger hits and rougher surfaces, the fork becomes much more noticeable in the way it helps manage impact, settle the front wheel, and make the bike feel more composed in everyday rough road situations. From this wider angle, it's easier to see how those rougher road conditions affect the whole bike and the overall riding experience. And this is where the suspension matters, not just visually, but in how the bike actually feels underneath you. On the rough parking lot surface, the difference becomes more obvious. Instead of the front end bouncing around too much, the fork helps the bike stay a little calmer over repeated uneven sections. That makes the ride feel more manageable, especially in the kind of rough urban terrain you might come across in real everyday use. So overall, this isn't just about comfort on smooth roads. In rougher conditions like speed bumps, curb drops, and uneven pavement, the front suspension helps the bike feel more settled, more controlled, and more confidence-inspiring. For this part, I wanted to focus on how the rear suspension works over the same rough road conditions. And compared with the front fork, the rear shock affects the ride in a different way, because this is what you feel more directly through the seat and lower body. On smoother pavement, the rear suspension doesn't draw much attention to itself, which is actually a good thing. The bike feels stable, settled when comfortable, and the rear end doesn't feel overly soft or too bouncy. Once the road gets rougher, the rear shock becomes much more noticeable. Over repeated bumps, rough patches, and uneven sections, it helps take some of that direct impact out of the ride. So instead of every hit going straight into the seat, the rear end feels a little more forgiving and easier to live with. And from the rider's point of view, that makes a real difference. You still feel the road, of course, but the bike doesn't feel as harsh or as choppy underneath you. It helps the ride stay more comfortable, especially when the surface is consistently uneven. So overall, the rear suspension adds another layer of comfort in everyday riding. On smoother roads, it stays controlled and unobtrusive, and on rougher roads, it helps the bike feel more settled, more comfortable, and less tiring to ride. Alright, now for the hill climb test. For this one, I'm starting from a dead stop at the bottom and using level 5 to see how the WF750 handles this parking garage ramp, which is around 20 degrees. On the first run, the bike gets moving pretty cleanly and climbs without feeling stressed. There's no real hesitation, and it makes its way up the slope in a smooth and controlled way. At the steepest part, it gets to about 10 miles per hour, which is a solid result from a standstill. Then I did the same test a second time, again starting from 0 speed, and the result was pretty much the same. The bike goes up without much drama, the power feels consistent, and overall it handles the climb with no real issue. So for everyday riding, the WF750 feels pretty capable when it comes to short, steep urban climbs like this. Now let's see how the lights look out on the road at night. For this part, I'm riding in full electric mode, so it's easier to focus on the lighting itself and how visible the bike feels in motion. As I come through, the front light is easy to pick up, and once the left turn signal is on, it's clearly visible from the front and side. As the bike passes the camera, you get a better look at the rear lighting. The left rear signal is easy to notice, and the brake light also shows up clearly when slowing down. Then on the next pass, I switch to the right turn signal. And again, it stays clearly visible while riding, with the rear brake light standing out well as the bike slows and comes to a stop. For this part, I switched into pedal assist mode to see how the WF750 feels in a more natural night ride. And one thing that stands out right away is that this bike has a very different presence compared to a typical e-bike. With the retro, moto-inspired styling, the long seat, the tank-style frame, and the fat tires, it has a much stronger visual character, especially at night. So while you're riding, it doesn't just feel practical, it also feels like the bike has a lot more character. At the same time, pedal assist keeps everything smooth and easy, so you still get that natural pedaling feel without putting in too much effort. The headlight gives you a clear view ahead, the bike feels stable at a steady pace, and the overall riding position stays relaxed and comfortable. So overall, the WF750 feels smooth, easy to ride, and a lot more distinctive than your average everyday e-bike. For this part, I wanted to show the full lighting setup at night and go through each function one by one. Starting with the headlight, once it comes on, it immediately gives the bike a much stronger presence from the front. The beam looks clean, bright, and much more usable for riding after dark. Then with the headlight turned off, you can see just how much that front light changes the overall visibility of the bike at night. After that, I switch on the left turn signal. From the front, it's easy to notice right away, and from the rear, it also stands out clearly. Then I do the same thing with the right turn signal, and again both the front and rear visibility look clear and easy to pick up. Finally, when I hit the brakes, the rear light becomes even more noticeable. The flashing red and blue light adds a much stronger visual effect from behind and makes the bike feel a lot more distinctive at night. So overall, the full lighting setup looks practical, clearly visible, and definitely more eye-catching than a typical everyday bike. So overall, the WF750 is smooth, comfortable, and easy to enjoy, with a design that stands out from the crowd. For everyday riding, it offers a really nice mix of style and practicality.